To illustrate the basic workflows within PBR Painter 3, I'm going to use a simple rock generated with Blender's Extra Mesh Objects add-on. This add-on comes with recent versions of Blender and simply needs to be activated in the Preferences window, although I had difficulty finding it in Blender 4.4.3. So I downloaded it from Blender's extensions. The current version is 0.4.0. In object mode, the rock generator is found under the Add menu. Select Add menu, then Mesh, then Extras, then Rock Generator. I used the rock as initially generated. That is, I didn't change any of the settings. I did apply all of the modifiers. An easy shortcut is to right mouse button click while the mouse is hovered over the 3D editor window. Then select Convert to and Mesh. I then unwrap the mesh using Smart UV Project. By hovering the mouse cursor over the 3D editor window, selecting the U key, and then Smart UV Project. I set the margin to 0.006, then selected Unwrap. To texture the rock, I chose AmbientCG.com's Rock 058 and downloaded the 2K PNG zip. This is all by way of setup. Now comes what I really wanted to show you. Switch to the PBR Painter workspace. The first step in multi-channel texturing is to add a material by selecting New. You can name it whatever you like, but I'm not going to bother. Next, you add a layer by selecting the Add Layer icon. I named the layer Rock. Leave the layer type as standard and select OK. At this point, I like to switch from Refresh Material to Auto so that the workspace will automatically update as I work. Next, you select the Multi-Import icon to import the texture downloaded from AmbientCG.com. I'm going to use the color, normal, and roughness. With auto refresh selected, the textures show up immediately on the mesh. There are many changes you can make to your textures, but let's just look at one. Notice the seam that has appeared on the mesh. By selecting the mapping chevron to open the panel, then changing the mapping from UV to Box PBR Painter, you can remove the seam. And that's it. To multi-channel texture, 1. Add a material. 2. Add a standard layer, and 3. Import the textures. To paint a texture set on a mesh, one simply needs to use a multi-paint layer instead of a standard layer. As with multi-channel texturing, the first step in multi-channel painting is to add a material by selecting New. Next, you add a layer by selecting the Add Layer icon. However, this time you select the multi-paint layer, then select OK. Again, I like to switch from Refresh Material to Auto so that the workspace will automatically update as I work. Next, you select the Multi-Import icon to import the textures downloaded from AmbientCG.com. With the multi-paint layer, you get to choose the resolution you want to use to paint your mesh. I'm going to use 2K, 2048 by 2048 pixels. Notice that Create Target Image Texture is checked by default. Select OK and import your textures. Again, I'm going to use Color, Roughness, and Normal. You are now by default in Paint mode. When you hover the mouse cursor over the 3D viewport window, you will see a stencil of your texture in the bottom left-hand corner. To move the stencil over the mesh, you drag it by selecting it with the right mouse button. To scale the stencil, you hold down the Shift key and right mouse button drag. An easy way to adjust the brush size is to use the square bracket keys. Notice that if you move the mouse cursor away from the stencil before right mouse button clicking, you get a finer control of the scaling. Once you are satisfied with the position of the stencil, you can paint it on by left mouse button clicking. But this will only paint on the color texture. To paint on all the textures, color, normal, and roughness, you need to hold down the Control and the Shift key and the left mouse button. The color map will be painted on while you hold down the left mouse button. Then when you release the button, the normal and roughness maps will be added. This can take a bit of time depending upon the capability of your computer. The painting will also appear in the Image Editor window in the lower left corner of the screen. Moving the mouse cursor off the 3D viewport window temporarily hides the stencil. And that's it. To multi-channel paint, add a material, add a multi-paint layer, import the textures, and adjust the stencil and paint. One final note. It is important to remember to save your painting by selecting Save Images before closing the Blender file. Otherwise, your painting is not saved with the file. Even if you have Automatically Pack Resources selected under File menu, External Data, Automatically Pack Resources. Also, for some reason, the albedo, normal, and roughness, etc. files loaded into the multi-paint layer are not saved when you close your Blender file. But if you are interrupted and need to continue painting later, you can just reload the PBR material texture set. Having completed my painting, I select Save Images to make sure that my painting will be saved when I save and close the Blender file. Everybody has their own preferred custom keyboard shortcuts. To paint, I prefer not to use the mouse to rotate and pan. Instead, I have mapped these functions to the Alt-Option key for rotate and the Alt-Option key plus the Command key for pan. I use the Command key because I use a Mac. I still use the mouse wheel to zoom, although for fine control, I prefer to use the hand icon. Another change I like to make when painting with PBR Painter is to close the brush assets and the brush settings panes in the properties window on the left and drag the PBR Painter brush settings pane to the top of the stack. In this way, I can access the brush texture box to hide the stencil when the mouse is hovered over the 3D editor window. This may seem somewhat repetitive, as I have covered this in previous videos, but for the sake of completeness, I will include baking from PBR Painter and importing the model into a Trainz asset. To get the textured asset into Trainz, the structural information created in Blender must be linked in a very specific way with the textural information. The linkage is set up as a node tree in the shader editor window. Fortunately, PBR Painter is able to do much of the work by creating an exportable material. The workflow is the same for both multi-channel texturing and multi-channel painting. You first select the Bake button. Then select the General Bake Settings chevron to expand the pane. Check Save Textures externally and choose a folder. I usually place the textures in the same folder as the Blender file. Select the Material Exporting chevron to expand the pane. Choose the export resolution. I'm going to choose 2K, 2048 by 2048 pixels, and check Create Exportable Material. You can now select Bake and OK. To view the new node tree that has been created by PBR Painter, switch to the Shader Editor workspace and select the Material Exportable. You may want to move the overlapping nodes. Selecting the nodes in turn, then using the G key and then the Y key, you can drag them down on the Y-axis. In the 3D Editor window, you may also want to switch from Edit mode to Object mode. Now we are almost ready to export the model. We just need to make a couple of changes for the material and the texture files to be compatible with Trainz. Select the material exportable name and change it to material.m.pbrmetal. The texture files we imported from ambientcg.com have names that end in 2K, which is not acceptable to Trainz. For Trainz, the names need to be all in lowercase, no spaces, and end in either albedo, diffuse, or base color for the principled BSDF shader node color input. Either roughness, parameter, or parameters for the principled BSDF shader node roughness input, and normal for the BSDF shader node normal input. I like to make copies of the texture files and change the names to albedo, normal, and roughness. If you want to add a prefix, such as rock, don't use spaces. Now we need to replace the files in the node tree with the newly named files. Set the color space for roughness and normal files back to non-color. One last thing we need to do is to create meshes with less detail, that is, less triangles. Detail is expressed by the number of triangles that make up a model. A quadrangle counts as 2 triangles. Surfaces with more than 4 edges are also calculated as triangles. The total number of triangles is known as the poly count. For Trainz, there must be a model with a poly count of less than 500. For our rock, the poly count, that is the number of triangles, is 4,608. The poly count can be shown in the bottom information bar by hovering the mouse cursor over the bar, right mouse button clicking, and selecting Scene Statistics. Ideally, one wants to create meshes with 50% less triangles. So for our rock, ideally, we need meshes with 4,608, 2,304, 1,152, 576, and 288 triangles. However, as long as we reduce the poly count by at least 50%, we can get away with fewer meshes. Let's create just two, something in the neighborhood of 2,000 and just under 500. To do this, we will duplicate the mesh and then apply the decimate modifier to 2 of 3 meshes. I'm going to switch to the Layout workspace to duplicate the mesh. Then, after selecting the mesh in object mode, use the keyboard shortcut Shift plus the D key, then the Enter key. I'll repeat the process to create a third mesh, then name the meshes Rock Lod 0, Rock Lod 1, and Rock Lod 2. Now, selecting the Rock Lod 1 mesh, I will select the decimate modifier and set the ratio to 0.4. Hiding the Rock Lod 0 and Rock Lod 2 meshes shows that the Rock Lod 1 mesh has 1,842 triangles. I will repeat the process, selecting the Rock Lod 2 mesh, applying the decimate modifier, and setting the ratio to 0.1. Hiding the Rock Lod 0 and Rock Lod 1 meshes shows that the Rock Lod 2 mesh has 460 triangles. Satisfied that I have the desired triangle counts, I can apply the modifiers. We are now ready to export each of the meshes, Rock Lod 0, Rock Lod 1, and Rock Lod 2, individually, by selecting each mesh and then selecting the File menu, Export, and FBX. I have set a preset for the export settings called Trainz, which sets the right panel to Limit to Selected Objects, checked. Object Type, Mesh, selected. Scale, 1. Apply Scaling, FBX All. Forward, Y forward. Up, Z up. Apply Units, checked. Use Space Transform, checked. With the file name set to rocklod0.fbx, all one has to do is select Export FBX. I'll repeat the process for Rocklod 1 and Rocklod 2, changing the name of the FBX file to rocklod1.fbx and rocklod2.fbx, respectively. When creating a Trainz asset, one needs a small file to display an image of the asset when the asset is uploaded to N3V's download station. The file must be 240 by 180 pixels. You can create this file in many ways. One way would be to take a screenshot of the model in Blender and, using a program such as GIMP, crop and reduce it to 240 by 180 pixels. I have a generic file I have created that can simply be duplicated and used until I have the asset in Trainz and can take a picture of it in context. I've named the file thumbnail.jpg. Now that we have all of the files for a Trainz asset, the albedo texture file, the roughness texture file, the normal texture file, the 3 FBX files for the 3 LOD levels, and the thumbnail file, we are ready to assemble the Trainz asset. I'll open Trainz and the Content Manager window. From the filters in the Content Manager window, I'll select Today. In the Developer menu, I'll select New Content to create a new asset. I'll then select the new asset and right mouse button click and then select Reveal in Finder. You will see the content.txt file that Trainz has created in the folder. I'll open the config.txt file. There are 2 lines of text, a unique identifying number, and a line showing at the moment that the kind of asset we are creating is unknown. The identifying number has 2 parts. The first is your unique identifying number. Separated by a colon is a unique number assigned to this asset. Each time you create an asset, this second part will be unique. Trainz can create several different kinds of assets: scenery, track, locomotives, etc. So you need to identify which type of asset you are creating. A list of different types of assets you can create is found here. In our case, it will be a scenery asset, so we will change unknown to scenery. Now let's copy the minimal information needed to create and view the asset in Trainz. The config file consists of a number of lines of text called tags: Trainz build, username, category class, etc., and a number of containers. In this case, there are only two containers, the mesh table and the thumbnails table. I'm going to make the asset compatible with Trainz 2019 and above by using a Trainz build number of 4.6. I'll call the asset Rock Tutorial. A list of possible category classes can be found here. I'm going to use BB, which indicates that the asset is a buildable asset. Mesh table LOD transition distances are the distances in meters from the viewer at which the asset will appear. I'm going to set the distances as 500 and 1000. That means LOD 0 will be in view close up. Beyond 500 meters, LOD 1 will be visible. And beyond 1000 meters, LOD 2 will come into view. The mesh container holds the information from the FBX files. Containers have a specific bracketing format. Each open bracket must be followed by a closing bracket. Each mesh, in our case, the 3 LODs, must have their own section. The FBX file data will be incorporated into a Trainz mesh file. So for each FBX file, we need to create a Trainz mesh file with the name of the FBX file. For example, Rock LOD 0 followed by the train mesh suffix. That is rocklod0.trainsmesh. Setting the auto create line to 1 means that the asset will be visible in-game. If it were set to 0, the asset would not show up in Trainz. That is, it would be invisible. LOD level identifies which LOD we are programming for. The thumbnail container contains the name and the size of the thumbnail file. Again, the format of the container is important. In particular, all open brackets must be followed by closing brackets. Once all the information has been entered into the config.txt file, we can close the file. Now we can add the texture files and the FBX files and the thumbnail file by dragging them into the asset folder. Finally, we can close the asset folder, and in the Content Manager window, right mouse button click the asset and select Submit Edits. That is, submit all of the changes we've made to the config.txt file and the asset folder. If all goes well, the status of the asset in the Content Manager window will change to modified. We are now ready to view the asset in Trainz.